Been giving these talks on the basic Buddhist teachings for, it's got to be close to 2 years now. And it would figure that the first talk Chiezan says we should put on YouTube as a talk I don't have a topic for. If I tell you what I've been studying this week, it would be Netflix. But we just came out of a pretty intensive week of meditation with our 8-day Denkaway session, where a tremendous amount of practice was occurring, and a lot of looking at the Buddhist teachings. So Chiezan giving quite a few talks, and he had me give a number of talks as well. And I think when I come back to this class, Basic Buddhist Teachings, the inspiration there is to try to resonate with the most basic aspect of our inspiration and our intention on the path. And that rolls right back around to the first noble truth of life is suffering. That was the very first talk I gave 2 years ago. And then you progress through the teachings after that, but everything else is in a sense an elaboration. And it has been said that the Buddha really only gave one teaching, and that was not a verbal teaching, and yet it has been elaborated in countless ways. But I think coming back to that first noble truth of life is suffering is a pretty important place to start and to remind ourselves of. And so our first inspiration on the path is to find some sort of sense of ease. We're suffering with the relative world, with our emotions, with our relationships. And many of you, probably like myself, tried to exhaust every other option first, the easier options. A relationship, more money, drugs, prescriptions, finding a counselor to tell you what to do so you would be happy. And the last resort is to look for ourselves. For most of us, we've really exhausted a lot of outlets before look for yourself. And for some of us, we were avoiding that. For others of us, we didn't know it was an option. We just didn't know that we could actually just look at this for ourselves. And if we come back to that first noble truth, our relationship and understanding of that inevitably evolves over time as we practice. And what is painful about the first noble truth is that in that evolution, it does not particularly go away. And in a sense, at least initially, it's going to have to increase. And that's because we have developed so many tools for mitigating suffering. We've developed so many strategies and so many narratives and so many identities that try to validate ourselves as opposing or as opposite the very suffering that we came to the path with. And as we begin to practice, the suffering can increase because the reference points themselves begin to become unstable. They begin to become transparent. And so instead of feeling a greater sense of relative confidence on the path, you have, at least initially, the ego feels a greater sense of insecurity. And so the other foundational aspect of the path to me would be meditation. So we have the first noble truth of suffering, but Buddhism is not just an intellectual path. It's not enough to just think about that first noble truth. We're given a practice. We are given a transmission. You could say that's what we talked about for Denkaway. We talked about transmission in different forms. So we are given the first transmission, which is how to practice shikantaza, how to practice zazen, how to hold everything still and see that you cannot be still, how to endeavor to observe and see how you can't help but interfere. And so the suffering begins to take on an even more visceral quality because we actually see that our very stories around the suffering, the very elaborations around the suffering also function as a protection. Even when we're telling ourselves a story, working ourselves up, at least we have a validation for the suffering. At least we have a reason. We know why we're suffering. But as we begin to sit, and those reference points come under the same suspicion, under the same scrutiny as the suffering itself. We actually have to begin to recognize a more intimate relationship to suffering, which is very threatening, because we begin to see that the nature of dependent existence is suffering. And I don't think that's intended to be pessimistic. Actually, I know it's not intended to be pessimistic, but by the very nature of buying into this cause and effect world, by thinking that that's how we're going to get ahead or fall behind, we see that all of our activity, so long as it's grasped at, inevitably is suffering. And so you could say there's a sense of helplessness on the path. The optimistic part's coming, but not tonight. I haven't gotten there myself. No, the optimistic part is recognizing the freedom you have when you cease making demands on the dependently arisen world. That cannot be done conceptually, and it's not enough to talk about it. And in a sense, it's almost like a wasted breath to talk about it, but maybe it gives us a second thought. Maybe it's enough. We can't see it. We can't imitate it. We can't just elaborate it conceptually. But that in any given moment, as causes and conditions come together, the freedom is in that you have no demand, that you recognize realization is not the cessation of dependent origination. Like Bai Zheng said, he said, one who has seen the truth does not ignore cause and effect. Chiezan sometimes says you're completely at the mercy of cause and effect. You're not at the mercy in the sense of becoming stupid or becoming an automaton. You're at the mercy in that seeing you do not have the say-so that you think you have. And so we start to enter into this space, this terrifying space of helplessness. And it feels like that because even though there's some insight into the dependent nature of things, we're still grasping at identity. We're still grasping at a self who's trying to navigate the dependent origination. We think that I will have patience with the suffering of the world. I will have patience with the confusion of the world. But there's still this thought that I will cease my own confusion. And so it's very difficult to recognize that. We see it in others a little bit. We actually see that you can't blame somebody for arising out of their causes and conditions, but we're not ready to take responsibility for the insanity or the negativity that has a right to continue to manifest out of this body-mind complex. You don't get to separate yourself in that sense. The bodhisattva does not get to accomplish at the expense of the rest of the world. And so we have to learn to, you could say, abide in the midst of the continued arising of causes and conditions. I like the phrase that Chiezan has used in taking your seat. Of course, it still has a path quality. Of course, you still think you're taking your seat, but you're taking your seat not in opposition to the causes and conditions, but out of inspiration to see the causes and conditions as they arise. To see that, to function out of compassion does not mean that the causes and conditions of anger do not arise. It's very confusing at this point because you have the causes and conditions for anger, but you also don't get to separate yourselves and function out of something special. So you are in the midst of your anger, you are able to relate to the world, but not out of, not synonymously with your impulses. That reminder of you don't have to get rid of anything. You don't have to get rid of anything. But at the same time, you're not completely consumed to the point of losing yourself as just anger. And so the path quality, the path practice of sitting meditation is not to understand that. Like what I've just said is not helpful. It's not helpful to understand that is not helpful. But to give us enough pause to take a second look at what we just assumed to be the case. There's no way to strategize this. There's no agenda, and yet we can have forms that help, that you could say support taking that look, taking that closer look. So basic Buddhist teachings, the basic teaching of the Buddha was not verbal. And that is not new. That is the Buddha touching the earth under the Bodhi tree. That's the first chapter, the Diamond Sutra, where the Buddha just takes off his robe, sets his bowl down, and makes a seat for himself. And yet, because that's not apparent to us, we think that there's something more. We think we're confused about it. So we ask for more. So the Buddha says, life is suffering. The cause of suffering is wanting things to be permanent that are impermanent, fighting with things as they arise, grasping at things as they go away, ignoring things as they sustain. So he says, life is suffering. Here's the cause. Says there is cessation to suffering, but it's not cessation of dependent origination. And it's also not cessation as caused by dependent origination. It's that kind of the paradox of Buddhism. And he prescribes a path of discipline, meditation, and wisdom, also the Noble Eightfold Path. But in the midst of all that elaboration, the Buddha is just saying, sit and see for yourself. You could say his first teaching and his last teaching, and every teaching in between was sit down and see for yourself. And so that's what we intend to do. And that does not have to be at the expense of our intellect. We don't have to be a non-intellectual person. It doesn't have to be at the expense of our emotions. We don't have to be an emotionless person. There's just absolutely no standard that can be set up. So knowing that, beginning to see that for ourselves, you could say we begin to step on the bodhisattva path because we begin to appreciate how unique this is for every single person as they step on the path. Just like our path is so unique day by day based on what we're having to look at. So see that life is suffering. We sit down, we take a form, and we see that there's nothing to do. I think I've heard Chiezan say this once, and this was, I think, maybe in private, and I can't quote it, but it resonated with me because it's sometimes how it looks to me is the misunderstanding is to think that there's a misunderstanding. I've heard somebody say, I'm confused about it. And it's like, no, you're not confused about it. You're trying to clarify. You're trying to find something other than the very thing that's presenting itself to you. So you could say that's another aspect of optimism, is that you're not confused. There's nothing to be confused about. There's no clarity to discover underneath the confusion, but we have to be intimate with whatever aspect of dependent origination is arising moment to moment. And we have to have that intimacy without looking for a direction, that dependent origination is pointing us in some direction. It's complete as it arises, and yet it's empty as it arises. And I think perhaps this is where Dogen says that shikantaza or zazen is a practice of ease. And you actually can enjoy yourself. And enjoyment has so little to do with how you're doing. Enjoyment can be struggling because you're not fighting with the causes and conditions of struggle. Enjoyment can be confusion because you're not concerned about being confused. Enjoyment can be being corrected because you're not concerned about being correct. But we can't just implement that. We can't imitate that. So what can we do? We can just notice the constant tension and warfare and directions and positionality that arises perfectly out of dependent origination. And I come back to that teaching that I brought up during Denkoei from Koben Shino Roshi, where he told his student, just practice till your death day. Practice every day until your death day. And to me, that the way it struck me as a fruitional teaching that was not a path teaching. And yet we hear it as a path teaching because we think practice till the death day until something happens. And he's just saying for infinity in all directions and times, just practice. Incredible teaching. Other questions?
Jishin bowing.
Yes.
When you say practice for infinity, how do we practice after we die? Bowing.
Again, he's not giving a linear instruction. Practice until your death day. I know that does not make sense, but it is not a linear instruction. You are practicing right now after your death. You are practicing right now before your death. You are practicing your death right now. And just the intimacy to me of that teaching. And again, it's completely wrapped up in my own subjectivity. So practice right now. Practice right now. And how do you do that? You're doing it. You show up. Listen, you ask questions, you consider. But also just have it as a little itch in the back of your mind that you are not confused. And that does not justify acting out of our thoughts and impulses. If anything, it just causes that pause, that sudden, again, I like that word impact, that makes us look again. Shoro.
Shoro bowing. Why might it be disappointing to hear that we're not misunderstanding bowing?
Because we think that we should live our lives based on feelings and sensations and thoughts and concepts and logic and reasoning. And to hear that it doesn't make sense. It is not gratifying. It is not the escape we had hoped for. It is not something we get to take credit for. And so we just continue to struggle because we're so entrenched in that identity, and that identity needs constant feeding. And the teachings skillfully provide very little sustenance. Just enough sustenance for the student to continue.
Sure, bowing. I'm thinking of the teaching or the idea of we just need to see that the ego is unreal, we don't have to get rid of it. Is it necessary to cut some of the sustenance out to see that it's unreal? Bowing.
Again, my bias is I'm very tentative about subjectively crafting my path. And the reason is the ego's subtlety, the sneakiness of it, is it finds a way to make a credential out of anything. And so no matter how good your thought pattern or your logic of how if I could just stop doing this, I could be more spiritual or more in line with the path, the ego loves that. Even when we fail, we love it because somebody failed and we see and we'll do it better next time. It's, I think, why when we give the teacher permission to step into that, completely threatening. It's completely threatening because we are not strategizing our own path. It's not at the expense of our intelligence, but you may have, I don't know, I know in my practice before coming to Sokokoji, it's like you meet these people that are a wealth of knowledge and they've been accumulating teachings and sayings and quotes and practices that completely align with how they feel about the world. And they've created this perfect cocoon of spirituality that it's airtight. And if you go through it logically, they have every point, they've got it thought out, but there's no disruption. They're unwilling to receive anything that is not in line with that form of spiritual prejudice. I think that's also why the Sangha is so important, because it creates a similar disruption, because you can't control the Sangha. You can't create a harmonious Sangha. even in the most strict of conditions, going back to the time of the Buddha, you put people together, they irritate each other. And if you've ever looked at any monastic codes, they are airtight. I mean, there is a protocol for every type of conflict, and yet they continue to arise. So putting yourself in the midst of a community that's not intending on maintaining an image or maintaining consensus seems to help crack into that shell of ego. Hondo.
Brian, can you define again what you mean by intimate when you're saying you need to realize a more intimate relationship with suffering?
The intimacy will not show up as directional. You will not have any reference point by which to define it. If we were to give it a word, the ego would call it helplessness or confusion or being lost. And I come back to these sayings because they're helpful to me, and maybe they are to you, but it's just like Dongshan, Lianchi, Tozan Ryokai's teacher saying to him, not knowing is most intimate. So Dongshan presented his, I don't understand what you're teaching me. And the teacher's like, yeah, good. And couldn't be more intimate. As soon as you know, you've created a filter. Sokuzan said something similar today during As It Is, and again, I can't quote it, but I remember hearing that something similar. If you know, as soon as you know, there's another reference point, there's another filter, there's another layer, there's another wall of the mind. So even the not knowing, though, does not have to be at the absence of knowing. It's just seeing clearly that that is not something that needs to be grasped onto or gotten rid of.
Shadow bowing. You were bringing up the uniqueness of our path, and I'm curious what the importance of like some conformity, like I'm thinking like the Samaways and the Raksus. So if we're with that idea of the uniqueness, why have conformity?
You can get this thing as tight as you want and you'll still have uniqueness. So you don't need to worry about finding ways to express yourself. We need structure. We need some sort of container that helps us see our intention in a way that's more physical, more palpable. The intention sometimes is not always as clear, but when you come into a space with an altar, when you come into a space and everyone has a similar form of dress, it's a way of acknowledging the intention. It may not be the intention itself, but to me, it is a way of manifesting the intention. It provides support. It provides a vehicle by which to practice. So we don't want to get so idealistic that we say, well, I just need to express the Dharma in my own way. No, you express the Dharma mutually, but the mutuality of this situation is we have a container, we have forms, we have a way of approaching this. We also have communication, have some consideration. So things can adjust situationally. But to go too far, we just get into a situation where we just fuel impulses and preferences. It can be irritating. The Samui for me, I personally find it a little, I don't know why. I've always found uniforms very irritating. I literally quit the Boy Scouts because I would not wear a uniform anymore. Everything else was fine. I liked camping. We shot guns. We went fishing. It was cool stuff. But I was not wearing that uniform. I was that close from quitting marching band because the uniform was so dorky. And other people love it, I would say once a year I see Sokuzan in a cowboy shirt. Less now. Maybe it used to be once a year, now once every couple of years. It has a function, and it's not just for us, it's for others. Something Mahakasyapa said about his vows, something the Buddha said about living in forest dwellings is also for others. Navid.
David bowing. Is it beneficial to try to sit for longer periods of time at one sitting? Bowing.
Well, I think it can be. I don't know that we can set it up as a standard, but I think it's definitely can be helpful to lean into that area a little bit. If we go overboard, we tend to burn ourselves out. We're like, I'm going to sit 8 hours a day for a month. And then it's like after that month, I'm never sitting again. So that's not particularly helpful. But what I do feel is that when we get into those periods of extended meditation, you can't maintain a good meditator. You can't maintain a sense of meditation. You just start to sit there, and the ego, that's disappointing because it's like, this is so, I'm not meditating, it's too ordinary, my mind's just racing, I'm fidgety, and yet you get to go right into the very area that you need to see. So extending meditation, I would say for the most part, is probably a good idea to do some of. I think it's something that we do again in tandem with the teacher and in tandem with the community and the forums. But not to set it up in such a way that it becomes aggressive towards oneself. Thank you for that question, Navid. Are there further questions this evening?
When the Buddha taught the Eightfold Path, was meditation like after a bunch of like correcting some of your relative situation with like speech and things like that? Bowing.
I have no idea. Something I think that is important to consider, and when I say important, it's not important. Just something that you may want to consider is the cultural context where meditation was not new. The Buddha probably did not need to spend a tremendous amount of time instructing meditation. Dogen probably did not need to spend a tremendous amount of time instructing meditation, whereas here it's not there culturally. We were not raised around meditators. We didn't have parents that meditated. So we hear a lot of meditation instruction. It seems helpful. So it's probably likely that many of these people came to the Buddha with some sense of meditation, and he may have modified that to some extent. But that's something I notice when we talk about, well, how do they instruct meditation? I can't find meditation instruction from this teacher or that teacher. And part of it is they may not have needed to do a lot of that. And the other part is we do see it. We've talked about how Sinsin Ming or Sandokai or Hokyo Zanmai, those are all meditation instructions in a sense. They're all endeavoring to encourage us to look at what is arising precisely as it is. It's just not always like hold the body very still, keep the senses open, receive whatever arises in the sense fields. Thank you. Eric.
Eric Melly. May I ask you a why question?
Absolutely.
I've been struggling with the four immeasurables recently, just kind of getting tripped up the more I think about it. And you were talking earlier about suffering. And so I'm just curious, why would we wish that all beings be free from suffering?
I would say to me, there's a few aspects to that. One of that is simply the intention. It's you could say it's like a way of cultivating relative bodhicitta. You're just trying to cultivate well-being for others. May my life be oriented towards alleviating suffering. The other thing is I feel that it's important to respect. I don't know how to say this. It may not be appropriate for everyone to wake up right now. And that being the case, we should endeavor to help them be at ease, if we can, without being aggressive, without being condescending. So to think that everyone needs to do this, what we are doing, does not acknowledge, again, the unique causes and conditions that arise. And so I think Hui Nung said it. I think he addressing what you're asking about. Hui Nung's way of saying it was, if somebody's ready, teach them the Buddhist teachings. If they're not, teach them to be kind. So if you're not going to wake up, if someone's not ready for that, we may be able to support them so they don't have to be in so much pain. That's something Kelly and I are doing on a weekly basis. We're going to the library and meeting with teens whose causes and conditions are, in a sense, unimaginable to me. Never had to do what they had to do, or live through what they've had to live through at such a young age. And so I don't go down there and say, here's how you attain enlightenment, here's how you need to wake up. I go down there and just be a kind adult. Bring them pizza sometimes because they're hungry. It's simple, but it's enough. And to do any more is to think that we need to change them, fix them, save them. Can just be kind. Want to do more, but there has to be permission. Take a few more questions if there are any, or I could.
Isaac Bowing.
Go ahead, Isaac.
During meditation, when are we not observing? What does it look like to not observe? Bowing.
That's a really great question, and I think that it's probably I could answer that two ways. It doesn't matter if you're observing, or that you can't do anything but observe. I think the repetition is part of that. I think that as we work with the teaching, we just continue to return and return and return. We want to do this well. We want to do it expediently. So we start to try to, am I observing here? Did I slip into not observing? And it's not a practice of ease. It's a practice of fear. It's a practice of discipline. It's a practice of aggression. So the observation is just noticing whatever shows up. You can't help but notice that. That means if you notice that you're daydreaming, or that you've been daydreaming for 10 minutes or half of an hour, that's still awareness. That's still observing. If we get too caught up in the particulate, it's like we're just constantly reifying the one that thinks it's observing. And I really liked when Sokuzan said, you can't even see the part of your mind that's being trained. Help me have a little bit more humor about the part that thinks it's training.
Isaac Bowing, are you saying that there's nobody that's observing?
I would say that that's a way of saying it, because whatever story is telling you about observing, it's still another, it's completely empty. It's without self nature. There's nothing there to receive credit. Nothing there to progress. There's nothing there to develop or nourish. So fundamentally, there is no observer, and yet there's only observation. I think something like perception only. There's no perceived, there's no perceiver, but there is perception. There's just perception. So similarly, there's nothing observed, there's no observer, but there's observation. And again, those are just expressions of the path. That's not to do away with that part of you that thinks it's observing. That's also to be included. That's also a completely perfect expression of causes and conditions. So don't try to do away with that. There's no need to elaborate on what is arising spontaneously.
I just answered my question, but so if there's nobody that's observing, how is observing not a fruitional teaching? Why is it a path teaching?
All of the teachings are path teachings. Even when I say Kobin's giving fruitional teachings, it's still a path teaching. It's still trying to create a reference point. There's still some differentiation. There's nothing that can't be expressed there that can be expressed that's not a path teaching. And yet you could say everything is a fruitional teaching at the same time. You're not able to differentiate those, because if they are differentiated, then you just have relativity fighting with relativity. Sometimes Buddhism talks about polarizing. And again, I'm not saying that so that will make sense, but it gives us a chance to look a little bit closer at that. Even when Sokuzan quotes the 16th Karmapa saying nothing happens, It's fruitional if you actually see it. But at the same time, to just repeat it, hopefully gives people inspiration, but it's still just an aspect of the path. There's something about what Coben said to Angie Boiseving that I used to not be able to talk about it without crying, and even now it's like it's there if I want it. If I wanted to cry, if I felt like crying, it's available, but it's still path.
Thank you.
Thank you, Isaac. Muzuku.
Muzukabine. I'm not, what do you mean when you use the word differentiating, that we differentiate?
Do you ever lecture yourself about your confusion? So you're differentiating, you think that there's something else to see. You think that your confusion is incomplete or an obstacle or lacking in some way, so you differentiate. And that happens in countless forms. There's so many aspects of our life, but we always make exceptions. We tell a story where something is not quite enough, or we tell it is enough. That's another story. It's hard to say that everything is completely appropriate without giving somebody something to grasp onto and then justify what's going on. It does not justify. There's no justification. So that's what I'm saying with differentiation, is that we just continue to fuel this idea that there is something else. Thank you. Stand and dedicate the mirror. Tomorrow we have senior monk training day. If you're able to join us at 10:30 a.m. and 2:30 p.m., the monks will be talking about excerpts from Eihei Koroku and Shobogenzo by Dogen.
May the miracles penetrate small places, so that we and every sentient being together can realize the Buddha's way. Chi, San, Chi, Chi, San, Sa, Wo, Sa, Wo, Cha. The 10 directions, the 3 times, all Buddhas, all venerable ones, Bodhisattvas, Mahasattvas, the great Prajna, Paramita.
O Buddhas and Bodhisattvas of the 10 directions and the 3 times, please hear us. Please come down out of the light and protect Sokokoji Buddhist Temple Monastery, our Sangha, families, friends, and visitors. Heal everyone who is unhappy, sick, or suffering, and fill them with light.